Well, hello and welcome to today's episode of Breaking the Taboo. And we're on series 3 and we've been reading feedback from you as listeners. And a popular episode that we did in series 1 was looking at post-traumatic stress disorders for mums who'd had a difficult birth. So we thought we'd revisit the topic with a slightly different angle today, which is looking particularly at intrusive thoughts and how to support you all, but also to have a conversation about recovery and help with parenting post-birth trauma. So I'm delighted to have 2 guests with me in the studio today to talk about this. And the first is Meg Murray Jones, who is a reflexologist, breathwork practitioner and mum of 3. It was her first traumatic birth in 2016 that led her to create Postpartum Plan to support new parents with their emotional and physical recovery postpartum. And I'm also delighted to introduce Zara Kadir, who is a child, adolescent, adult and family psychotherapist and the founder of The Therapy Shed, a space dedicated to helping families understand their emotions, strengthen relationships and find calm in the chaos of modern parenting. And perhaps, Zara, we could start with you. Could we talk a bit about what intrusive thoughts are and what are the kind of symptoms that mums might be exhibiting post-birth if they've had a particularly difficult time?
So firstly, let's just start with that they are extremely common. I think it's about 100% of mothers have intrusive thoughts about accidental harm coming to their children, and about 70% have intrusive thoughts about intentional harm. So intrusive thoughts are unwanted and distressing mental images or fears. So typically things that pop into your mind when you least expect it, and lots of kind of what if scenarios. So I'm a mum of 2, and I know for me it was things like I'd be wearing my baby in a sling. What if I trip on the tree root and I land on top of him and I squash his head? That would be a really classic intrusive thought that dads as well will also have. The ones about intentional harm, which are slightly less common, but still very normal, especially postpartum when you've got a lot of hormones and a lot of hypervigilance, would be things like, oh my God, what if I hit my baby? What if I shake my baby? What if I put a pillow over my baby's face? Like something really distressing. And, 99% of the time you have no desire to do it, but it's the intrusive nature of it, which is so unsettling.
Well, that's such a helpful start and an introduction to the topic. And what really strikes me firstly, Zara, is how incredibly normal this is, but actually we just don't talk about it. And I remember one mum I met after chairing the birth trauma inquiry in Parliament last year, and she told me she was completely convinced that there were just bombs outside her house and she could not leave her house with her newborn baby because she was convinced they were going to die in an explosion. And completely irrational fear, but one that she just believed was totally real. And Meg, you had a very difficult time with your birth. What were the kinds of things that you thought about in this scenario? And it'd be great if we could talk a bit later in the episode about examples of help.
Yeah, so I had a traumatic first birth and there was a risk of brain damage to my son. I think it's just important to explain the context of it first. It was a birth pool, lovely birth that went wrong in the last minute, and then there was a risk of brain damage. So he was taken away and put in an incubator for 72 hours and I couldn't touch him. And that lack of touch impacted me a lot. I shook for 3 days basically until I could touch him again. And so after that, really I still have them and it's 9 years on, but very severely after his birth, it would be what I did wrong in birth, how I could have done it right, replaying the birth. And then after that, I remember when he was 4 months old, we went to South Africa. And before we went, every single night, I would think about if the plane crashed, how I would save him. So my intrusive thoughts were quite specific to, I couldn't save him during his birth. And so how can I save him through every single little crazy and benign situation that there could be? Now, those intrusive thoughts are much less, but I still have with my 3 children, what if, which is exactly what Zara said. So I think it's also important to say that they still happen. As Zara said, it's very normal. But at that time after birth, it was very, very severe and incredibly intrusive. It would kind of prevent me sleeping.
Yeah. And one of the reasons we have this podcast is to break the taboo by talking about this, because so many mums have told me that they just don't share this with friends or family or work colleagues because they're, worried they might get referred to social services or be considered a harm to their baby. But as we're discussing now, lots of mums will have a very difficult time post birth if they've had a traumatic experience, and this is normal. And in many cases it will, pass within a few weeks or a few days, and there is help available. So Zara, why is it that intrusive thoughts are happening? Could you just talk a bit about the kind of the brain and the body's protective system, and how we're kind of responding to these perceived threats to our body?
Essentially, it's about your very primitive instinct to keep your baby alive. And it's something that obviously has served us really well as a species because we've done pretty well. And it's literally just about scanning the environment for potential threats to your baby's safety, because your baby has zero survival skills of their own. So it's just about that hypervigilance. And obviously, you're very hormonally driven. I know that when my son was born, the day he was born, I felt like I could hear every single baby in the borough. My hearing became so acute. So it's just one of those very, very primitive biological things that's designed to keep your baby safe.
Well, that's so true. And one of the things we're trying to discuss in this topic in the episode is to sort of make mums more aware of what these things are, and so they have a better understanding when something's happening to them, that they know that this is just an example of an intrusive thought, and how to deal with it. So Meg, you mentioned there about the kind of things you were thinking about. Could we talk a bit about the kind of physical symptoms?
Yeah, and I think this is really important because I think we as women of a certain age know now that some thoughts that we have aren't necessarily true. So I'm able to intellectualize it when it happens. When I worry that my son's going to fall out a window, I can go, okay, well, that's not going to happen. But what happens is physically, the adrenaline's already pumping through my body. So what I feel is like a tightening in the chest. And then I can almost feel like the cortisol, the adrenaline coursing through my body. And that's the bit that causes, I'd say, the stress, the longer term issues if it carries on without help. Because if you're constantly having that adrenaline pumping through your body, then that's signaling to the brain that there's danger. And then the brain signaling to the body there's danger. And there's all of this loop that goes, right, of like danger signals, which means you can be stuck in fight or flight. And I was definitely stuck in fight or flight for a very, very long time. I returned to work, I had a breakdown, I had to quit the corporate world. Like, there's been a lot of unraveling of what happened after the birth to support my mental health to return to where I am now. And a lot of that is due to the body's response to what it believes to be a natural threat, because the brain doesn't know what's real and what's not. So the body doesn't know what's real and what's not. So if the brain's thinking these thoughts, then the body's going to react. So I have suffered with, and I say suffered, I think it's really important to say, like, I have suffered with those like bodily reactions to those intrusive thoughts on and off for quite a long time.
I think what Meg pointed out that's really, really poignant as well is there's a really big difference between having an emotional response and being triggered. And I think the word triggered and the word trauma have entered our vernacular in a very colloquial way. As with lots of mental health conditions, everyone's a bit OCD or a bit autistic. And actually, these are pathologies where you have to meet a certain criteria to be diagnosed. And what Meg's talking about is being triggered, where your body reacts to an old wound or danger that happened. And it's a trauma response where your nervous system fires up, your heart rate spikes, your logic fades, and you are flooded with those past feelings. An emotional response for someone that hasn't necessarily suffered a birth trauma, but has those very common responses and very common intrusive thoughts, is something that's uncomfortable, but it's a proportionate reaction. So I think it's really great because Meg very clearly was triggered, and then what I would call flooded, where your body is very much flooded with the feelings that you had at the time.
Yeah. And I'd love in this episode to talk a bit about how we cope and deal with these situations. And I remember writing about a similar experience in my own book, Breaking the Taboo, where I talked about the first time I left the house with my daughter in the car to drive to see some friends in the pub for a coffee. And I literally drove, I think, 2 miles, and I must have stopped every couple of 100 yards. And I was convinced that she wasn't breathing in her car seat. And I'd get out, go to the back seat. And obviously she was completely fine, just looking out the window. And because I couldn't, see her when I was driving, I was just convinced that she died in that like couple of seconds since I'd last seen her. And now I've had help with my mental health recovery post my my traumatic birth, and now I'm completely fine and I can sit in the car with her for 4 hours and there's no problem at all. So I'd love to chat a bit about what support is out there for mums who are in a similar position to myself and Meg, and to know that they're not alone and that there is help out there. So Zara, perhaps we could start with you. Could you just talk us through a bit about the different therapeutic approaches that are out there for mums in the UK?
Sure. So there's kind of traditional talking therapies. It's very broad and there's 1,000 different types. So I won't list all of them, but essentially what most therapists call themselves is a kind of integrative therapist, which would be speaking about the traumatic event, unpicking it, connecting it to any past experiences, what you felt, what you think about yourself now as a result, and talking it through, which is a long, drawn out process and can take time and can be quite triggering in the process. CBT would be, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, is about neuroplasticity. So what I mean by that is about rewiring your brain. So if you have, kind of, as you said, Theo, like a negative automatic thought. So when I'm driving, oh my God, what if she dies in the car seat? That's your automatic thought. So CBT would be about putting that thought through a process of, okay, how likely is it? What else is also possible? What else could I believe? And forcing yourself to have those alternative thoughts until that neurological pathway becomes stronger. And instead of the negative automatic thought, you have a more rational, reasonable one. And again, it's a lot of conversation, and you would get sent kind of homework, essentially, would be worksheets. So anytime you had one of those intrusive thoughts, you would write it down in the worksheet and put it through this process of kind of Socratic questioning. And then EMDR, which is very trauma focused, is a very strange kind of therapy to be part of as a therapist and as a client, because it involves eye movement. So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And it's about bilateral stimulation. So when you have an unprocessed trauma, it means it's stuck in a part of your brain that thinks that that thing is still happening, which is why you get triggered and flooded. So when you follow your therapist's hand, kind of going back and forth like this, or it might be a light bar or a sound or something in your hands, it forces the kind of the two hemispheres of your brain to integrate that memory into something that was in the past and isn't happening. And the beauty of EMDR is you don't actually have to talk about it. So you just have to have one image that you can offer to the therapist, and then you can start to process it, but you don't have to really dig deep into it. So it's a lot more gentle if you have had a real trauma.
And it's so interesting hear you talk about EMDR, because I was one of those mums who I have to say was very skeptical about having any therapy. And it was my husband who saw that I was really not myself after our daughter was born. And he very strongly advised me to have therapy. And that's the type of therapy that I had. And I found it so interesting how it almost kind of reprocesses your brain and the memories of that really traumatic event. I say, Meg, the way I kind of see it is that I think when I first was thinking of the memories, it was almost like I was still there in situ back in the hospital and it was happening to me. And now it's almost like I'm kind of watching myself on a DVD. So it's almost like I'm kind of one step removed, and it's helped to process the memories. So Meg, what kind of therapy did you have as a mum who'd suffered from intrusive thoughts and mental health issues, and what helped you?
So I did a few, and I think there's really interesting points here. So first of all, I just want to say that there's lots out there and you've got to find what works for you. So CBT worked really well for my husband, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but partners have birth trauma too, and they can also have intrusive thoughts. My husband thought about cutting the cord. That was his intrusive thought because he never got to do it. So that was his one that he'd kind of kept on coming back to him. CBT worked really well for him. It didn't work for me. And the reason why is because so much of mine was in my body rather than I kind of knew that the stuff that was going on in my mind wasn't real. So the stuff I did, Theo, probably, it was more of like the woo-woo stuff that you mentioned before that possibly feels like it doesn't work. But for me, it did. So for anyone out there who wants to explore. So I did EFT, which is emotional freedom technique, and that's tapping. So you tap on certain parts of the body, and that's releasing from the body the stress or the trauma. I also did something else, which I think is called TRT. There's so many acronyms of these things. But essentially, it is the body shaking to release the energy. I mentioned before that for those 72 hours that I wasn't with Jude, I would wake up violently shaking, freezing cold and violently shaking. And that is the equivalent of when like an antelope gets chased by a lion and it survives and it gets up and it shakes, and it's an animal response to kind of getting rid of the trauma. And that really worked for me. So actually more body work. And then there's other stuff like belief coding, which very similar to what you just said, where you kind of go back to the time and you see yourself as a spectator instead. So there's so much stuff out there. It's just, I guess, it's affordability, because a lot of this stuff can be expensive. So that's really important to mention. And also trying stuff out and just knowing what works for you. The cheapest form of therapy for me was journaling. And I journaled the birth from beginning to end, and making sure at the end I wrote, and at the end this happened. So I knew that it was like a closed loop. So for anyone who's out there who can't afford these big therapies, just journaling it has been really beneficial to me.
I so relate to that. And I think that's partly why I ended up writing my memoir, because obviously having such a traumatic birth has almost become a form of therapy. Writing it down and getting it down onto the page has almost helped sort of download some of the memories out of my brain and hopefully into my book to help other mums. And Zara, what strikes me listening to what Meg's talking about is it's so difficult to regulate your own emotions as a parent, particularly as I don't think we were taught any of these things when we were growing up. So could you just talk to some parents about what are the kind of practical ways that they can kind of, ground themselves? What's kind of healthy ways that they can regulate to model in front of their kids as well?
There's a great acronym by a psychologist called Tara Brach, who she's also a meditation teacher, and it's RAIN. So R is you recognize what's happening and you name that feeling. So I'm having an intrusive thought. A is that you allow it to exist and you don't try and push it away, because that's often the thing is people will tell you try not to think about it. But if I say to you guys now, don't think about a bear, don't imagine its fur, don't imagine its big nose, don't imagine its claws. I mean, I would, put money on the fact that you could not avoid any of those things. So when you say don't think about it, it's actually just going to make it worse. You have to accept it and allow it. And then be curious, what's this telling me? So actually, sometimes the goal with any kind of anxiety isn't always to get rid of it. It's to see what your body is trying to tell you and then decipher whether that is a valid message or not. So, we have a kind of smoke alarm in our brains, and sometimes that smoke alarm goes off saying there's a fire, but actually it's just burnt toast. And I find that to be a really helpful one when I start to feel that kind of fizzy anxiety of like, it's just burnt toast. And then the N in our acronym is nurture. So it's okay to feel the way I'm feeling and I'm doing my best. So I think that any kind of mantra, phrase you can live by, that you can practice in moments of calm, so you can access it in those moments of chaos, is a really great self-help tool. So even if you simply say to yourself, I'm safe, or thoughts aren't facts, because again, if I say to you, think about the weather, you are not the weather. So your thoughts don't define who you are. So I can recognize what I'm thinking. I can allow that thought to exist. And then I can be curious. Okay, it's telling me that actually I really care about keeping me and my child alive. What a lovely thought to have, but it's burnt toast. It's not a fire. And it's okay, and I'm doing my best, and I'm safe. And having those little thoughts to access, sometimes I tell clients to write them down and screenshot it and then have it as the background on their phone. So every time you open your phone, it says, I'm safe, or thoughts aren't facts. And those things are just really easy to tap into. And again, if we think about that CBT model, the more you practice it, the stronger that muscle gets and the easier you will access that feeling of calm that you had.
Yeah, that's such good advice. And Meg, you mentioned that you'd done a lot of body work. Could you talk a bit about kind of breath and talking to friends and family and things that you did to make you feel safe?
You noticed before when, Theo, you were talking about going to the pub and having to check your daughter every 2 minutes, right? And we all smiled, because almost it's like, but of course that wasn't going to happen. And I think sometimes we hold on to these worries and they grow and grow inside us because we think that they're real. Whereas as soon as you release them out of your mouth, they almost can sound as ridiculous as the chance of them actually happening can be. For example, I had a thought before we went to South Africa with Jude when he was 4 months old, that what happens if an eagle flies down and grabs him and flies off with him, right? That was like a legitimate thought. That, wow. Yeah, but we can laugh about it now. But I didn't tell anyone. Isn't that crazy? So like as an invitation to everyone, just to say those thoughts that come into your head, because as soon as I told my husband, fair play to him, he did laugh. And then that kind of broke the gravity of the idea of the thought. So talking to people, I didn't talk to anyone, Theo. No one. I remember when Jude was 8 months old, I went to one of my best friend's wedding in Mallorca. There were 7 of us friends, and I had told no one. And I was in such a dark place. And I just couldn't tell them even then. And that's when I knew I needed to have some help. But now I'm able to speak about it and kind of laugh a little bit about some of the thoughts that come into my head. That's really helped. And also, you will be so surprised, like even at the school gates, talking to a mum and go, oh my God, I felt that too. That there are so many people out there who probably feel the same, or just have so much compassion for you. And I think that leads on to the breath thing, which is clearly I had no compassion for myself because no one judged me for those thoughts, but I was judging myself. So when those thoughts come into my head, I used to be like, oh my God, Meg, that's crazy. What are you thinking? There's clearly something wrong with you. And now even when they come into my head, I'm like, okay, it makes complete sense. I haven't done the burnt toast thing, but I'm definitely going to do that now. It's okay. It's okay. I completely get why you're thinking that. And also, we know that that's not true. And it comes from more of a place of compassion and love for myself now, which I think I just didn't have, because the whole premise of my trauma was I did birth wrong. I failed my son. And that's where it all came from. So deep, deep compassion for yourself without sounding too American about it. But like actual really, when those thoughts come in, meeting yourself with, I completely get why you feel this way. Because if my 7-year-old daughter came to me, which she does, because she does worry, and says, I'm worried about going to school because, of X, Y, and Z, I would never say to her, don't be so stupid. I would go, of course, I completely understand. I'd give her a big hug. So why don't we do that to ourselves? And then that is where the breath work comes in, which is breathing into a moment and allowing yourself a breath before you react, before you start to think negative thoughts about yourself. That breath pause can be one of the most magical things that people do.
So true. And what strikes me listening to you, Meg, as well, is there's still such a shame, and I think in a silence about talking about these issues. And, parents don't feel safe to share what they're thinking. And part of the point of this podcast, right, is to literally break the taboo by talking about this. So, Zara, could you talk a bit about that and how we can kind of have safe connection and compassion in reducing the sort of the power of these thoughts?
Yeah, I think, what Meg said is absolutely right. You just start with telling one person. And I can almost guarantee if you choose a mum friend, then she will immediately say, oh, yeah, I think those things too. And just not keeping it a secret, because when you keep it as a secret, it just becomes so toxic and it grows inside and it gives it power that it doesn't have. And like Meg said, as soon as she told her husband, he kind of demystified it by having a really appropriate response, which is that that's ridiculous. So I think, yeah, it has to start with just telling somebody so you realize that you're not on your own and that also you are not mad, because I think it's really sad that we all live in fear of social services. Social services are there to protect vulnerable children. And if you are having a thought about what if harm comes to my child, that's not a vulnerable child. That's a very well cared for child. So actually recognize that this is you actually being the best version of a parent that you can be, which is scanning the environment and making sure that there are no threats, and just making sure that you then rationalize actually what is a threat and what is, a figment of your imagination. But I would just echo what Meg said and just start with just choose one person you can tell, and they are not going to phone social services and have your child taken away for imagining something bad happening to them.
Yeah. And I'll say, I've said this point many times before on the podcast, but I'll say it again, that if mum's had a traumatic birth, that's something that's happened to you, not because of you, and it's not their fault. And there should be absolutely no shame in asking for help. And do check out the show notes for this podcast, because there'll be a lot of useful links in there for relevant charities. And Meg, I was struck that you talked about your husband and the fact that he had intrusive thoughts too. And I just don't think we talk about dads enough in this experience. And I know my husband, when he wrote his story down for my book, really said that he didn't think he could go through me being pregnant again because he was so traumatized by the whole event. And because he's the partner, he wasn't offered any mental health support at all by the NHS because he's not considered the patient. So I'm very conscious that there are lots of dads out there listening to this podcast who either want to help their partner but also need help for themselves. So what happened to Dave, and is there any advice that you have for partners in a similar situation?
Dave when we went up to neonatal, so we were allowed in like 6 hours after Jude was born, and he was in this neonatal. He was cooled because that prevents brain damage. So we couldn't touch him, which is the bit that really got me. But at least I had the neonatal nurses coming to me, explaining the situation, and full compassion, because they're obviously doing their job and they're saving children's lives. But one woman just handed Dave a piece of paper, a printed out A4 piece of paper about brain damage. That was it. That was it. And he did what I did to him, which is he went out of the hospital and called his mum and cried, composed himself, and then came, oh God, I'm going to get emotional, composed himself and then came back to me because he felt he had to be strong for me. And then he wasn't given food for those 3 days. He went home at night because we didn't have Jude anyway. That had a massive impact on his mental health. Huge. I mean, and what's sad is that we were both kind of living in these silos of wanting to be strong for each other, but not really kind of telling each other what was going on. Similar to what you said, Theo, when we got pregnant very quickly after, like 9 months after Jude's birth. And the whole way through, Dave was like, I want you to have an elective C-section. I can't go through that again. And that's similar to what your husband said, which is that for them, they are so lucid in that birth experience, right? Like we're kind of high on whatever, we're high on adrenaline, drugs, whatever it may be, but they watch everything. And I think I agree with you. I just don't think enough is spoken about for partners and their mental health, because also they go back to work after 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it may be, and are expected just to be the same person again. So for him, it was a lot of dreams about cutting the cord. He was very, very anxious about Jude's health because there was this risk of brain damage. And we had 2 years of physio just to double check. Obviously, he's totally fine. He's a thriving 9-year-old. So it was all preventative. But for those 2 years before we got the sign off, he was a very, very anxious man. And it had a massive impact on his work, right? So he'd be in work, he'd be constantly checking his phone. And then unfortunately, I was that woman who was calling him at 4, being like, you have to come home, like in tears. So it did have a huge impact on his confidence at work, how he showed up at work. He stopped seeing his friends because he felt he had to be with me the whole time. Like the list goes on what an impact can be on a partner too. So I'm not sure how many partners you have that listen to this, but if this is the episode that like a mum gives to her partner and says, just listen to this segment, just to know that it's okay and to know that you're going through the same thing as well. I think that would just be really important.
I think that's such a powerful point. And it reminds me, Meg, that in series 1, we did a really powerful episode for dads who'd been affected by birth trauma, where we have 2 dads who came on the show to talk about their personal experience, one of whom had a military background and was really frank about how difficult he found it. So do check out that episode if anyone's listening who wants particularly support for fathers. And Zara, it strikes me as well, there's the parent point about your partner and how they're affected. There's also the wider point about other children. And a lot of the mums who are listening to the show have other siblings and they're finding it very difficult to recover from the birth of their new child. So is there any advice that you have, particularly on kind of parenting and how we relate to intrusive thoughts, things like setting boundaries, and any kind of practical advice that you'd like to share?
If you are struggling, then children are like bloodhounds, and what they lack in comprehension, they make up for in intuition. And if there is an environment, if you are anxious, if there's an atmosphere, if your jaw is tense, your shoulders are tense, if, you're sleep deprived, so when your husband says something, you roll your eyes, they will pick up on all of those things. So you have to tell them something, and it has to be age appropriate. So obviously you don't want to lump your anxieties on your child. Your child is not your friend or your therapist, they're your child. So you have to protect them, but they also deserve to have some words given to what they are experiencing. If you've had a birth trauma and your body is recovering, and that means that you are less available, I would offer your child your words for your experience of actually, my body has just been through a really, really big job of getting a baby out, and now I need time to recover. And that means sometimes when you ask me for things, I will have to say no, or I will have to offer you an alternative. And I know that might be really difficult, because a boundary is always about what you're going to do in response, not what the other person can or can't do. So you can't say, you can't ask mummy to play with you because I'm recovering, because of course they can ask you. But if you're very consistent in always telling them what you're going to do in response, then they will feel safer when you do exactly what you said you're going to do. And then to offer them the words for what they're experiencing. So actually, there's one mummy and 2 children, and sometimes there's just not enough mummy to go around, and that's really difficult. And you can bring your doll, and when I change the baby, you can change your baby, and you can give them, again, things that they can do, so you don't feel like you're always saying no and telling them what they can't do, but actually always telling them what you are going to do in response.
Yeah, no, that's such good advice. And I think we don't talk enough about the impact on siblings when it's really difficult for the mum, that they either can't look after the siblings in the same way that they did before, or they're struggling to look after the newborn baby because they've had such a difficult time with their physical and mental health. And Meg, I was also struck that you mentioned earlier about the difficulties of going back to work. And that's something I'm particularly interested in, because again, I don't think we talk about that enough in society. I think we make these assumptions that you've just got your 6 months maternity leave, and at the exact date that finishes, you'll be back in the office, ready to go, and everything will pick up as normal. And as we all know, that's just not the case for so many mums. So could you just talk a bit about postpartum recovery and what happened in your situation? And then perhaps we could talk about the fantastic work that you do to sort of support businesses to help mums to get back on their feet at work.
I feel like corporates are amazing at giving time and money, but time and money doesn't necessarily equate to emotional and physical recovery, right? So that was my exact story. So I was given a year off, right? Really well paid. I was in this big corporate job, but I came back after my second. So bearing in mind, this is quite a long time after Jude's birth. And I came back after my second, and the company I worked for was all about supporting women. It had brilliant parental leave policies. And I just felt like I couldn't cope. And I ended up having a breakdown. And I was off for 6 weeks. And then I was standing in the sea with Dave. And I just turned to him and said, I can't go back. I can't go back. Like, I need to work out what's going on with me. Bearing in mind, for the audience, I'm a reflexologist, I'm a breathwork practitioner, like I work in the wellness industry, whatever that is. But so just knowing that someone like me who has the tools still can feel that way, I think is also really important to normalize the fact that going back to work can be really tough. And what I think happened, and what I'm doing a lot of work with companies with for now, is to teach that if your nervous system is completely shot after birth from birth trauma, prolapse, whatever it may be, and you return to work with a belief that you need to be the same person you were before, you are going to struggle, and you're going to think it's your fault. You're going to think that it's the juggle, or it's the fact that I can't do work and child, and you're going to quit, when actually a lot of the time it's down to what's going on inside your body and the being triggered or being activated on certain things, like an aggressive email from a client, or someone looking at you funny in the office, that before you might not have thought anything, but now your fight and flight is so engaged that you think that something awful is happening instead. So yeah, I'm working with corporates now to help them understand that even partners, they come back 2 weeks later, companies expect them to be the same person. They're not. They're sleep deprived, they might be traumatized, and it's helping understand that when you return from parental leave, understanding a new identity of a person or of an employee, so you can support them better.
Well, I relate to so much of what you just said, Meg. And I remember when I was reading over 1,000 stories for the birth trauma inquiry, how many mums said that they weren't able to go back, and they just really needed a more compassionate and empathetic employer to let them come back in their own time and be much more flexible. And I think we do need to have a conversation in the UK about paternity leave only being 2 weeks long. I mean, I couldn't look after our daughter, and my husband had to go back after 14 days, and I couldn't even pick her up. I mean, we do need to have more support out there. And I think that's a good way to introduce us to the question that I ask all of my guests on the show, which is about policy. And as a former politician, I'm always interested to know what my guests think the government should be doing to improve care for mums. So Zara, perhaps I could start with you. If the Prime Minister was listening to the show and you'd like him to do something to help new mums with their recovery, what would it be and why?
I think as a self-employed family, my husband and I are both self-employed, I would say more support for the self-employed, because my husband didn't get 2 weeks paid paternity, he got none and had to take all of it unpaid. And then secondary, I would say education, that actually, I remember going to NCT, and I sadly don't think anything that I was taught there was actually useful. And I was told, with breastfeeding, like, oh, you pop the baby on this like knitted boob like this, and none of it was like that. And then once you're out of hospital, you have to figure it out. And how incredible would it be if, when you were going through that process with your midwife pre-birth or after birth, when you have the health visitor, that they say to you, tell me about your intrusive thoughts, because I'm sure you're having them and they're completely normal, to break the taboo and stop leaving it for women or dads or parents to be the one to volunteer it and have to take that step, but actually to really pave the way for you.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And Meg, I can see you're dying to jump in with, I'm sure, lots of recommendations.
Well, actually, I was going to say to that, Zara, isn't it interesting how the GP goes, and how are you? And that's just such a non-question. Imagine if our GP said at the 6 and 8 week check, now I know intrusive thoughts are really normal, so if you're having any, you can let me know. What an amazing way to open up a conversation about what's going on. Because when they say, how are you? Usually it's like, yeah, I'm okay. But it's such a massive question to ask, right? For me, my thing has always been that if more companies could understand that your employee disappears for 3 months, 6 months, a year, and in that crucial time, a lot can go on. And actually, if corporates were more educated and understood what was going on in that crucial postpartum period for women, men, partners, whatever it may be, surrogacy, adoption, and giving them the tools that they needed to support themselves so they can return to work thriving and feeling like the company understands what they're actually going through, I think we'd have a massive increase in retention of women, especially staying in the workforce. I think it was something like 43,000 women left the workforce in the UK in 2023. And I think that's like a 1% increase on the year before. I think the figure keeps rising. It's like 1 million globally. That we've got a lot of amazing talent leaving the workforce when mums have the most incredible skills to bring to any workplace. So I think it's a massive loss. And I think it doesn't cost much for a company in thinking about it, in acting on something, and doing something for people during parental leave that can help keep their employees for longer. So that's what I would ask here to do.
Also, just kind of to go with what Meg said, we've spoken about dads a lot. And I think something that not everybody knows is we all know that it's common knowledge that women's brains change after having a baby. Men's brains change too. It's not just us that have a different biological hormonal response. If you have a gay couple with 2 dads, their brains will change irreversibly. So none of us can return to who we were, because once you have children, when the child is born, so is the parent, and you are changed irreversibly.
That's so true. And Meg, I was really struck by your comments about the GP appointment. One of the things that I campaigned for very hard in the House of Commons when I was elected was to actually change that, because I remember having my appointment 6 weeks post-birth. Bearing in mind, my daughter was absolutely fine. It was myself who'd had physical and mental issues post-birth. And I remember the GP appointment was entirely basically about my daughter. And at the end, I had a question to say, are you suffering from postnatal depression? It's a yes or no answer. And by the way, you have 1 minute left. And that for me really sums up how we needed to improve the system. So one of the things I'm most pleased that the UK government has done was to actually change that. And as a result of our campaign in Parliament with Rosie Duffield, they actually have brought in now a question on both mental and physical health for mums post-birth in that 6-week GP appointment. So hopefully that will start to filter through the NHS system and really start to improve the care. Because as you said, mums are much more likely to answer if it's a direct question about it rather than just a very open question. And finally, I'd love to ask you both for a really practical resource that you think would help mums listening today or families out there with their help and their recovery post-birth. So perhaps, Meg, if I could start with you, what would you like to signpost families to today?
NCT, I didn't love it. But if you meet people that are, or mums in the playground, wherever it is, like, if you've got a group of mums, I almost think it's like the best free resource that you can have. I found that speaking out about stuff and sharing stories for me is the thing that has supported my health the most. Finding a good podcast to listen to, Theo, you beautifully put the fact that the only podcast you could find was Happy Mum, Happy Baby, and you weren't happy. So finding the relatable podcast that works for you, I think, can be really important. But for me, that face-to-face eye contact with an amazing woman in your life, and I would say that's exactly the same for dads and partners. I know that men find it harder to talk about this kind of stuff, but making sure that they find that person that they can reach out to. It could be a sibling, it could be someone else. So that for me is free and one of the best things that I did.
Yeah, and also don't underestimate the value of just a WhatsApp group. I think the most useful thing I got from my antenatal classes was just meeting other local mums to sort of text someone at 3 a.m. saying, my daughter won't latch, what do I do? Please help. So I think, having someone to ask for help and the importance of peer-to-peer community support is so important. And Zara, what would you like to recommend?
Maybe unhelpfully, I would probably just say exactly the same thing, because obviously I could tell you about counselling directories and
well, tell us about that too, because
psychology.
that's also useful.
Okay,
where
so
do people find information that's a generally useful resource?
yeah, so if you're looking for a good registered and accredited therapist, you could start with the BACP, which is the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, the UKCP, which is a similar governing body. And then there's also other directories like Counselling Today and Psychology Today. And actually, when it comes to finding a therapist, if you are fortunate enough to be able to go privately, the saying is that the relationship is the therapist, is the therapy. So if somebody can have all the credentials in the world, but if they don't give you the feeling of someone that you want to talk to, then shop around, have first sessions with as many as you need until you find the right fit. And then just to kind of echo what Meg said, actually, mums groups, it is the most useful tool, because you're going to be around people who completely understand what you're going through, who, yes, will respond at 2 a.m, and will help you feel like you're not alone, because that is, obviously something that we've really, really seen is the biggest problem is people feeling alone with these thoughts. So reach out to anyone that you think will offer you some empathy and some kindness, and don't be afraid to tell people what you need. So I'm going to tell you something I'm struggling with, and actually I don't want advice, I just want you to listen.
Well, that is such good advice. And I think today's episode was, really practical for families listening today about what the kind of things that they might be experiencing, but also really helpful to signpost them to where to find resources. So can I thank both of my guests for coming today on Breaking the Taboo to talk about intrusive thoughts and recovery and parenting post-birth trauma. And if you've enjoyed listening to today's episode, then please do rate us on iTunes or Spotify and write a comment, because it helps other families to find us and get the help that they need. And if you've enjoyed listening to this episode and you'd also like to apply to be a guest on the show, please do go on my website, and there is a form where you can suggest topics or speakers that you'd like to hear from. And do get in touch with your feedback. We do read all the comments from our listeners, and many of the topics on this series were suggested by you all as our listeners. So thank you to listening to today's episode of Breaking the Taboo, and stay tuned for next week's episode. Bye-bye for now.